Namaste. As often happens, I choose a topic a month ahead of time or so, sit down this week and I'll do all of February, and something pops up in the news that's relevant to the topic after I chose it. Not that I'm claiming that that there's a causal relationship there, but it's always interesting that self-proclaimed messiahs, gurus, and teachers popped up in the news. But I'd rather talk a little bit about this gospel passage first because it's actually one of my favorites. The little quote from Isaiah that Jesus reads, I think, sums up what the spiritual life is really about. It's about preaching good news to the poor, proclaiming release of prisoners, recovery of sight to the blind, liberating the oppressed, and proclaiming the year of God's favor. Following it, of course, immediately is this rather fantastic or fantastical sort of claim that I'm the guy, which gets about the same reaction that we would probably give to somebody who made that kind of claim in front of us, leaving aside for the moment whether or not Jesus ever actually made that claim while he was in the body. We are, in our day, frequently confronted by people who have decided that they have something to share which isn't just of value. I mean, it's fine to decide that you have, hopefully we all have something to share that's of value to somebody, but of a unique value that you can't get anywhere else, or that we have a unique insight. And sometimes it's pretty obviously crazy, although sometimes it's hard to pick that out, when you get people like, it was Kenneth Copeland, I think, and somebody else a couple of weeks ago, who said of course they had to have private jets, because they couldn't possibly talk to and hear from God sitting in coach with all those people who are taking all those drugs. And the first thought that came to my mind was, why aren't they giving me the drugs when I'm in coach? Apparently you have to ask, I'm missing something, because whenever I'm in coach, but
you just get peanuts.
I get peanuts, you know, a crappy sandwich maybe that I have to pay for. None of the good stuff. And then comes the story in the news about this guy that they're calling the Whole Foods guru, which is a really unfair characterization. The reason they're calling him the Whole Foods guru is that the head of Whole Foods studied under Marc Gaffney. That would be kind of like saying, well, somebody was a Roman Catholic when Cardinal Law was in Boston. So, and it was somebody famous, let's say the Kennedy family. So we don't call him Cardinal Law anymore, we call him the Kennedy family guru. I mean, it's just not, we can all get sucked in, but even more basic, or basically than that, is the fact that just because I go to listen to somebody's teachings and appreciate them, doesn't mean that I'm somehow responsible for whatever misconduct they engage in. Well, I first became aware of Marc Gaffney a few years ago when I started reading this book called The Guru Question, by a woman whose name is Kaplan, I think Mariana Kaplan. And it was, do you need a guru, was what the book was about. So I thought it would be pretty interesting. And then I got to this chapter in the book where she was clearly trying to do damage control for Marc Gaffney, who it turned out, so I Googled him, was a spiritual teacher who, she was the mother of his child while he was also sleeping with 2 other women. And this was his first bad luck in American press. But even prior to that, he was a rabbi, and we have to kind of go rabbi, because there's questions about whether he ever really had the credential. And if he was a rabbi, that credential's been withdrawn. but he was over in Israel, and you'll never guess what he was doing while he was in Israel, but sleeping with members of his congregation. Especially egregious was that one of them was 13 years old. So they run him out of Israel. Not surprisingly, seems like a good move. They decide, whoever is in charge of rabbi credentialing says, and he writes a letter of apology to the community there, in which he admits that he engaged in some behavior that wasn't appropriate, but then once he gets to America, or he wasn't American when he wrote it, but then he turns around a little while later and says, well, I wasn't admitting that I did anything wrong. And now he gets involved with the good folks at Integral, the Ken Wilber people. Ken Wilber being, some people believe, he's the leading American philosopher. He is certainly an American philosopher who's done a lot of work in trying to come up with a system to explain and describe and measure how people do or do not make spiritual progress. So whatever my feelings about that are, for some reason Ken Wilber decided Marc Gaffney was an okay guy and none of this stuff could be true. And he's been teaching at Integral conferences. And now again, it comes up that he's sleeping with his students. So I saw, and granted I get a little twisted sometimes, but on the surface there's this similarity between what Jesus says, hey, guess what? God sent me to do this stuff, here I am, I'm the guy, and essentially what Marc Gaffney would have said as a rabbi, and even as a spiritual teacher. So how do you know?
Well, Jesus was celibate, that's all.
That's right, because nobody celibate ever gets into any trouble. Just ask the aforementioned cardinal law. So I found this fake guru test, which I thought was kind of interesting. It's 26 points. If you have 7 of them, then you probably should be worried. And there's just a couple of them I disagree with, and we don't necessarily need to look at all 26, but some of them should be kind of obvious. States his or her own enlightenment, and we've talked about that before here. Whether you're Eckhart Tolle claiming that you had an enlightenment experience at 28, or Andrew Cohen, who was another friend of Ken Wilber's, claiming he was enlightened, it's risky business. I don't know if any of us can be objective regarding our own level of awakening, and I have an article coming out in a week or two on one of the blogs. I don't even know if enlightenment is achievable in this life.
Hey, I reached enlightenment level 10.
That's right. And if you were in Ken Wilber's system, you'd have a color assigned to you. Is unable to take criticism. A lot of people are unable to take criticism, but one would hope if you're making spiritual progress, you would be. Acts omnipotently with no accountability. That's a big problem in a lot of spiritual movements. But the one that I kind of don't know that I agree with, specifically gives satsang or darshan when it's not part of his culture. These are meetings with the teachers in Buddhist and Hindu traditions. And I don't think what the author means is saying that you're giving satsang or having darshan, because teacher meetings are common. And when you start teaching within a system, yes, you adopt some of the cultural names. And so, yeah, there's some things that are a little strange to us in the Hindu traditions. Darshan often involves touching the guru's feet, which is seen as a way of expressing devotion. I don't know, that one, I'm on the fence about that. Living in total opulence, I don't think we should talk about Joel Osteen like that. Encouraging or permitting adoration from his followers. How much that is in control, one is in control of, I don't know. Number 12, speaks with an Indian accent or vernacular when he is in fact a Western. Or I would say, an Asian accent if they happen to be a Buddhist teacher and they are a Westerner. Where does this suddenly come from? And there's a bunch of excuses, but I don't know that any of them hold up. So if all of a sudden when somebody starts teaching, they are all of a sudden talking like this, and then you find them in the back room talking like I am now, that's a problem, but as are all forms of pretending to be somebody you're not. Runs expensive miracle workshops and courses. That we can go through prosperity gospel people to all sorts of contemporary spiritual teachers. 14 obviously is a big one. Takes sexual advantage of his or her followers. It's just always inappropriate because there's always an imbalance of at least perceived power. 17, slick presentations. I don't know that that's a mark of a false teacher. It might be somebody who's doing a lot of production to try and cover up they don't have much of substance. Gives himself or herself outrageous titles. We see this a lot even in the independent movement within Christianity. People who are suddenly doing everything short of declaring themselves the Pope. And titles are great, but again, if there's not substance behind them, or if there's not somebody else deciding these people needs the titles, that's an issue.
Oh, your grace.
That's right. That's right. Let me bring out my ring.
Liberator of all souls.
That's right. And that's 20 is not interested in you personally. That's sort of a balance though. They should be interested in you personally to a certain extent. It's when it goes too far that it's problematic. I think I've seen both. People pretending that they're far too important to be interested with the average person, and people who are far too intrusive. I had a colleague back in the day who decided that because people attended her spiritual gathering, she could get involved in all corners of their life and tell them what they ought to do about their relationships and all. So, it might be cleaner just to say that boundaries should be in place, but the teacher at 21 should also be accessible. You shouldn't have to go through a lot of other people to get to them. 22 is interesting, making false claims of a lineage. One of the things that's interesting about this is there's great division on this. Some people will claim that you absolutely have to be part of a lineage in order to progress spiritually. And others who really believe that will lie about their attachment to a lineage. There's one particularly sadly bipolar, uncontrolled guy here in the West who's never, thank goodness, really taken advantage of too many people because he's kind of inept at it, but who claims that he studied under, everybody from Gandhi and he was one of the 12 apostles, and he claims all these lineages and hoping that people will listen to what he says then and believe it even when it isn't so smart. And here's financial stuff again in 23. And 24 collects a large band of angry ex-followers. You have to kind of look at that though, because you can have large bands of angry ex-followers who just are angry because you establish boundaries with them and they're not very healthy themselves. There are certainly people in the Midwest posing as Tibetan gurus who are Western, who may or may not actually be who they pretend to be. So what does it all mean? I think it all means when you look at a spiritual teacher, you have to look at the spiritual teacher as you would look at somebody who just moved in next door, or is in the next office at work, or maybe is a relative, although relatives But if a spiritual teacher is trying to say or do things around you, or get you to say or do things that you wouldn't let your neighbor talk you into, it's probably a sign that there's a problem. If spiritual teachers seem to have all of these trappings, whether it's the clothes, the bizarre haircut, the wands, the sticks, the Kumari movie is an excellent example of that. If they have all the objects, but what they say has no substance, that's a problem. And then I think the biggest thing, the two biggest things today, particularly in the West, is, are they more concerned about your money than you? Or are they more concerned about sleeping with somebody in their congregation than, well, are they even considering sleeping with someone in their congregation? And I'm not saying that that goes on, too close to us. But it might. And the reason it's a problem is that it destroys communities. It destroys the person who's involved. But anytime there's sexual misconduct, like a Mark Gaffney, they hurt the people, obviously, who they are engaged in their misconduct with. They hurt the people who are part of the community and trusted and believed in them, who then come to find out that they aren't who they pretended to be. And I think the larger community has a responsibility. That first reading, that letter from Tami Simon, where Tami Simon said, okay, we're not going to publish Mark Gaffney's stuff anymore, is great, but she did agree to publish his stuff after he got basically booted out of Israel. We all should be able to go to any spiritual teacher and ask them about what they're doing. Why are you doing this? Can you tell me why you made this decision, even if it's about the most trivial thing? And they should be willing to answer that question. And in the end, what differentiates Jesus and Buddha and Muhammad and Moses and Krishna and dozens of other founders of great religious traditions is that when they said something, they were able to back it up. They didn't hurt the people who came to them to be helped. And in the end, when you look at the record of their teaching, the claims that they made were backed up by the work that they did. And so I think again and again we need to be reminded of this lesson that we should never put people on pedestals. Because if we lift them up and somehow try to turn them into something more than human, some sort of superhuman guru type, they're going to disappoint us. And we're going to have to take them off the pedestal. And that's always profoundly painful. So maybe we could just decide that we're all just people and proceed from there with caution. Amen.